The first huge steel Sally Port door slammed shut behind me, ringing in my ears as I stood in the rusty, stinky vestibule, waiting for the second door to open and let me into San Quentin's death row waiting room. Coming in as a visitor, I passed by the recreation yard enclosed by 12-foot high fencing lined with black fabric to block views of the San Francisco Bay. The waiting room was much the same way. Sunny, but the lower parts of the windows were covered so that anyone shorter than 8 feet couldn't enjoy the $1 million view. I was there to visit someone who was becoming a friend. The path to that friendship began a few years earlier when I moved from Massachusetts, where I was a founding member of Citizens United Against the Death Penalty during the conservative Weld administration. I moved to California, which was on a roll executing a couple humans every month. I found myself increasingly unable to function on those days. I don't know why exactly I've always been so opposed to the death penalty. Maybe because of my Catholic upbringing and that faith's intention to protect all life. Maybe because the first 20 years of my life were lived in a prison town where many of the guards were the fathers of my friends and later my brother-in-law. Maybe I was opposed to the death penalty because I witnessed over and over again in my life that violence just breeds more violence. I figured out pretty early that you can't show people that murdering is wrong by murdering people. And absolutely, I've been opposed to the death penalty because it's racist. It's a continuation of slavery. It's a continuation of Jim Crow. Death sentences, I know, have way more to do with race, place, and poverty than they do with justice. More recently, though, I've come to see executions as a kind of mass murder. Not the kind where many people are killed by one person, but the kind where one person is killed by many. An execution requires police, lawyers, judges, juries, expert witnesses, prison staff, and even a couple physicians to act as executioners. And it requires the consent of the populace. At that point, 34 million Californians were complicit in that murder, including me. I had to do something. When someone was about to be killed in my name, against my will, I had to do something other than just go to work as usual. So I connected with a group of people who, on the eve of every execution, would walk in protest. I'd see them on my commute across the Golden Gate Bridge, and then I would see them on the news that evening. So I started to join them at 6 in the morning at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. And we would walk 25 miles across the Golden Gate Bridge through Marin County, up the side of Mount Tamalpais, and we would end at the gates of San Quentin Prison, where we would sit in the cold fog for 6 to 9 hours until the public pronouncement of death. And we had 2 goals. The first was to bear witness to the violence that accomplished nothing and was done in our names. And the second was to make it clear that someone cared enough about our shared humanity to say and do something. We hoped to start conversations. And when reporters would come up to us and stick microphones in our face and ask us what we called ourselves, we'd say, we don't have a name. We just walk. The day after each execution, invariably someone at work would say to me, "I saw you on the news last night. I know how few days off you get, and I gotta know, why would you use those precious few days to protest the execution of a monster?" They use that word a lot, monster. And the thing I found is that because they asked me the question, they would actually listen to my answer. And that's a rare opportunity for an activist to be heard when we're normally just dismissed out of hand. What I told them was always the same. My faith tells me that all people have worth and dignity, that we're all connected. My faith compels me to treat everyone with justice, equity, and compassion. Everyone. They tended to respect me, so they would sit with that. But people I didn't know often had a big problem with my activism. Now, sure, there were times when lots of people would show up along with us to protest and walk. Like the time Tukey Williams, a Los Angeles gang boss turned children's book author, was killed. There were thousands of people walking that day. That was the day I got to meet Jesse Jackson in person and find out he is really tall. And I got to have lunch in a church basement, tuna sandwiches, with an amazing singer who I later realized was Joan Baez. But once, there were only 7 of us walking. The diehards, including 3 Unitarian Universalists and 3 Catholics. Just as our little group happened to be walking past my workplace in San Rafael, which we did every time we walked, we were carrying our signs as usual. A woman passing by slammed on her brakes, put her car into park, left it in the middle of the road, and ran over to us. She spit in our faces and screamed at us, "You should be ashamed of yourselves defending someone who would kill an old woman in her bed as she slept." I think she used the word monster. The thing is that I wasn't defending him per se. I was there on principle, defending us. Not that I could say anything to her. I mean, how could I say anything that she could hear? But this was the part of what she said that really cut through me. Through tears, she screamed, "I bet you don't even know her name." And she was right. I knew the name of the man who was about to be executed, but I did not know the name of the 81-year-old retired piano teacher he shot at point blank range in her bed before going to her kitchen and making himself a bowl of noodles. I know now. Her name was Elizabeth Lyman. Everything changed in that moment. From that point on, I made it my duty to know the names of every single one of the victims. Not only their names, but their family names, their careers, the people and the things that they loved. I learned as much as I could about them. And I reached out to Sister Helen Prejean, author of the book Dead Man Walking, which was made into a film starring Susan Sarandon as Sister Helen. She told me and everyone who would listen that the only way you can be truly compassionate and just in this abolition work is to bear witness to it all, to listen to the stories of the victims and the murderers, to accompany them all equitably. Her method for doing the work was all about our second principle. So a few weeks later, we were back walking. I knew the names of the dead as well as the name of the man about to die. I knew the names of the immediate family of the victims. I knew the names of the prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judge. As we crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, we were required by law to relinquish our signs. So as always, we wore these huge matching yellow t-shirts over our clothes and walked very slowly, 25 feet apart. And I used that half hour of solitude to pray. I prayed for everyone I could name and for all those I couldn't name, the friends and family of the deceased and the condemned, the police officers and the investigators, the medical examiners and the executioners, the prison guards. If there's one thing I knew from having a correctional officer for a brother-in-law, is that you can't do that work and be unaffected by it. You carry that work home. That work defines your outlook and it becomes part of you, and you pass that on to your family, to your children. I realized that's got to be true for everybody involved, the prosecutors, the judge, the jury, everybody. So I prayed for everyone directly and indirectly involved. And then I thought about the people who would be there that night cheering for that execution, including the people who would witness it from behind glass. And I prayed for them. I prayed that everyone might know peace, that everyone might have compassion for everyone else, that we might be more just, that we might be more equitable, that we might live in a world where we no longer believe out of desperation that the only way to end violence is with more violence. And from then on, every single time we walked, I prayed for the woman who spit on us. She opened my eyes. That fateful spitting event was witnessed by a coworker. The next day, she took me aside and confided to me that her best friend, a woman I had met numerous times, was engaged to be married to a man on death row. My coworker corresponded with him and thought that I might like to meet him. I have to admit, I was reluctant. The truth is, I didn't want to use him or his story in order to gain some kind of credibility as an abolition activist. So before I said yes to his fiancée, I did exactly what you would expect me to do. I Googled him. I learned about Bill's background, a bit about his wealthy upbringing, his Stanford education, his successful business, and a whole lot about the criminal act that got him on death row. On two separate occasions, he met a woman in a bar, went home with her in the middle of the night, and discovered that she had a daughter sleeping in another room. He tied up the mother, killed the daughter, and then killed the mother. Twice. That's 4 murders. Newspaper articles portrayed Bill as smug and self-righteous, believing that he committed not a crime, but an act of moral justice. There was something about the whole process that just didn't seem right to me. All the information flowed in only one direction. I had access to all this information about him and his acts and his trial. But I had very little information about the whole person. And he had absolutely no way of finding out anything about me. He would only learn about me what I chose to tell him or what his fiancée knew about me. So I thought about my favorite magazine, The Sun, and how many prison inmates write in every month, and how all of them reveal a surprising complexity of character and an unusually deep capacity for personal reflection. Kind of like Wesley Emerson Steiner, the author of this morning's reading that Elizabeth shared. One quick Google search, and I learned all about the crime that has come to be the thing that defines him as a person in the eyes of so many people who've never been imprisoned. I saw pictures of it. He's kind of a nice looking guy. He looks kind of sweet, actually. And it's that kind of thing that really gave me a lot of consideration about Bill. So I said yes. And we quickly began corresponding by mail, and he revealed himself to be much more than his worst acts. He was funny, smart, thoughtful, very proud of himself for mentoring younger men on the row. And it was really clear that his life was enriched by a deep and committed spiritual life. After a dozen letters each, I accepted his invitation and gave over my social security number to the prison system and authorized them to do a criminal background check to vet me as a visitor. Then I made my way past the gate, across the parking lot, through that sally port, and even got patted down multiple times in the process. They sat me down in a 4-by-6-foot cage in the middle of a large beige room filled with other cages. Bill was locked in with me, but only after he'd been patted down and thoroughly searched. Actually, it was a full body cavity search, to be precise. And we sat knee to knee, and we only started chatting after Bill took my hands and led us in the most intense prayer I've ever experienced in my life. After the next 40 minutes or so, I got to witness the respect Bill commanded on the row as someone who had been there longer than most inmates and literally any officer in the system. He treated everyone respectfully, and they reciprocated universally. I found him to be exactly as he was in letters, but there was something more, something that scared me. Beneath all the humble gratitude was a sense of entitlement. I found myself grateful, frankly, that he would never be free. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want him to die for his crimes. I don't want that blood on my hands. And the way things are going with the death penalty in California, it's unlikely that he'll ever be executed. But it scares me to think how little time it would probably take for him to return to his old behaviors if he were set free. Partly because of the entitlement, and partly because everyone would expect him to go back to the way that he always was. The combination seems like the recipe for a self-fulfilling prophecy. But you know, Bill introduced me to a couple other guys who had no other visitors. So I started visiting them. The sally port and the pat downs stopped making my heart race and my stomach sink. But eventually, Bill and I fell out of touch. We'd exhausted the theological topics that are of mutual interest. And then his fiancee broke off the engagement and our mutual connection. I moved to Ohio and I stopped visiting his friends. I know Bill is still on death row because everything about his life is a matter of public record. I'm grateful I got to know him, though. Not only because he gave me a glimpse into a world that most normies like me never get to see, but because he and the woman who spit on me taught me what it really means to practice our second principle: justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. All relations with all humans from that 4 by 6 foot cage to the courtroom, to the streets, to the bedrooms where horrible crimes happen in the middle of the night. Now, when I hear about a horrible crime, I don't think just about the victims and their families, or the perpetrators and their loved ones. I know we're all affected. Every single one of us. Please rise now or sit with compassion and